Yo, what's good, everyone? This is Shields. Welcome back. Welcome back. Today, we are going to react to how New York became the world's greatest city. Now, greatest city is an interesting one. Of course, we already did the London video. Go check that one out if you're into London. And London was more about how it became the capital of the world, which was more about diversity and migration and colonialism that led to a conquest of culture that kind of like receded back into London over time. But this one specifically is New York. So of course, New Amsterdam becomes New York. Over the last couple 200 years, New York's pretty much been the melting pot for the United States in terms of diversity. So kind of like hits that checkbox for London's little diversity thing, but it also plays a huge part into trade, into culture. Whether it be Broadway, whether it be movies, whether it be music, the zeitgeist of culture in New York. It becomes pretty much the emblem of the United States, especially as the United States grows, New York will grow. It's pretty much a huge tourism spot over, out of any city, you're going to probably pick either, Los Angeles or New York to try to go to, America and get a sense of what it's about. Of course, it goes without saying, Ellis Island and the immigration and, that just boomed the city through the industrial revolution, or just I can't name enough. I can't name enough. So there's like a lot of reasons why New York became the greatest city. But I'd love to get a deep dive. Now, once again, if you guys are new here, like I said, my name's Shields, and what we do is we watch all types of videos around humanities, history, culture, science, etc., and we get better within collaborating, connecting to one another just by learning together. So you're here, that's all that matters. So we're going to listen to This Is History, the reaction video. Let's go.
New York, New York. New York, New York.
Right. Okay, so one thing I don't really have too much knowledge on is like the boroughs. I know I'm gonna see if I can hit anything. Like I know you got the Brooklyn, right? There's Brooklyn, like you got Long Island, you got Manhattan, you got Queens, you got the Bronx. Yeah, I need to learn me some more New York. Never mind. Just keep going.
8.3 million inhabitants. 32,000 streets. 5 boroughs.
Okay, I was right. Staten Island. I said Long Island. Staten Island, Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, Bronx.
3 rivers, which altogether make up one city unlike any other on the planet.
True.
What's all the more remarkable is that when you stop to consider what makes the city so recognizable today, whether it be the iconic skyline, famous cultural offerings, or the energy of its streets, you realize
City never sleeps. Never sleeps.
that virtually everything that makes New
Times
York
Square.
so renowned the world over simply did not exist, even as little as a century ago. That is because much of the city's history has been shaped by constant evolution, development, and renewal, which has transformed New York unimaginably over the years. But how did this city, which started off as a small outpost for European traders just over 400 years ago, evolve into the sprawling mega metropolis?
And that's crazy, right? Because London, we did the London video, and Londinium really was a thing 2,000 years ago, almost. Right? So Londinium has been around for 2,000 years. New York City has really been around for almost 400 years. So, like, dwarfs in comparison of years, but is already caught up to London. Not quite, but almost is already caught up to London in terms of population, so forth.
That it is today. This is how New York became the world's greatest city. Long before the bustling streets and towering skyscrapers of modern-day New York, the area was full of dense forests, flowing rivers, and abundant wildlife. The land itself was home to groups of Algonquin-speaking Native American tribes.
Algonquin. Algonquin. That's how to do that.
Chief amongst which were the Lenape people, who lived in harmony with nature, hunting, fishing, and cultivating the land in an undisturbed manner for some 8,000 years, until the arrival of the first Europeans. The European
1500s?
exploration and colonization of the Americas began in
14.
earnest at the outset of the 16th century, as
Oh.
navigators from nations like Spain, France, and the Netherlands sought out new trade routes to these newly discovered and
The Dutch.
resource-rich territories. In 1524, the Italian explorer Giovanni da Verrazzano, sailing under the flag of France, became the first European to set eyes on the shores of what would one day become New York Harbor.
I didn't know that. I thought it was the Dutch to start that. Very interesting. French. Giovanni da Verrazzano.
Verrazzano claimed the area in the name of France, although any attempt to follow this up with colonial settlement failed to materialize. It would be almost another 100 years before Europeans would return to the area, and it would be the Dutch who would ultimately leave the first lasting impression on what would eventually become
New
New
Amsterdam.
York City. In 1609, the English explorer Henry Hudson, who was in the employ of the Dutch East India
Sorry, but he kind of looks like Shakespeare. I just pointed out. It's got to be the collar.
Company, had been tasked with finding the elusive Northwest Passage, purported to connect
Hudson Bay? Henry Hudson. Hudson Bay.
the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Whilst on this expedition, Hudson sailed up the northern river of New York
The
Harbor,
Hudson.
which now bears his name in honor of his discovery. He claimed the land on either side on behalf of the Dutch Republic and,
Wow.
in the process, established a foothold for future Dutch settlement and trade in the region.
Wow.
The following decades saw Dutch trading posts established along the banks of the Hudson River, as well as others dotted along the coastline, stretching from the Delaware River to Cape Cod, which formed the wider territorial claims of the Dutch colony of New Netherland. Initially, these isolated dwellings and their occupants were focused entirely on the commerce produced by the fur trade, but in 1624, the Dutch West India Company decided to send a ship full of colonists to establish permanent civilian settlements in the region. They first landed on what is now Governor's Island, but were then dispersed amongst the chosen sites for settlement across New Netherland. A small group were disembarked on the southern tip of Manhattan, after it was decided to construct a fortification there to protect the entrance to the Hudson River and the valuable cargoes of the fur trade which passed upon it.
Wow.
With that, the foundations of Fort Amsterdam were laid out in 1625, and it quickly formed the epicenter of a new settlement which sprung up around it. New Amsterdam was born, and so too were the beginnings of New York City.
New Amsterdam. Here we go.
Just to quickly pause for a moment, and let you know that making these videos
www channel, but we're going to skip this ad.
of therapy. In the following year of 1626, with the hope of legitimizing their claim to the new colony, the Director General of New Netherland, Peter Minuit, purchased the land of Manhattan from a small band of local Lenape Indians in exchange for traded goods worth 60 guilders, roughly $1,000 in today's money.
He bought Manhattan for $1,000. Insane.
From here, the colony began to grow, and under Minuit's successor, Peter Stuyvesant, its population reached some 1,500 people by the year 1655. However, Stuyvesant was widely disliked by the settlers for the policies that he introduced. These included regulations on alcohol sales, attempts to assert control over the Dutch Reformed Church, and the blocking of other religious groups,
I knew it was going to be religiously bound because that's usually how it starts.
such as Quakers, Jews, and Lutherans, from establishing places of worship in the colony. The Dutch West India Company attempted to intervene by introducing more lenient policies and reform. However, these plans were quickly interrupted by the outbreak of war. In the latter half of the 17th century, the Netherlands was locked in a fierce rivalry with England to become the uncontested maritime and commercial superpower of the age. Between 1652 and 1673, a series of 3 conflicts, known as the Anglo-Dutch Wars, saw Dutch and English fleets battle it out on the high seas for naval supremacy. It was against this backdrop in 1653 that the inhabitants of New Amsterdam decided to construct a defensive wall along the northern boundary of the settlement,
Wall Street.
modern-day Wall Street, to protect against potential attacks by English forces coming overland from New England to the north. Nevertheless, despite their best efforts to deter any would-be attacker, in 1664, the English sent a small fleet to wrest the entire colony of New Netherland and its capital of New Amsterdam from Dutch control.
Oof.
Stuyvesant was unable to call on any resistance and consequently surrendered the city without a fight.
Dang.
The English
He folded.
renamed Fort Amsterdam as Fort James, and the wider colony of New Netherland, as well as the actual settlement of New Amsterdam
York.
itself, as New York,
Yep.
in honor of James, the Duke of York,
The Duke of York.
who would later
Everything is English. Every single piece of the Eastern Seaboard is English, right? William Penn, Pennsylvania. Georgia, King George. Virginia, the Virgin Queen. I'll think of another one, and let me know if I missed one. Like, that's definitely not English.
become the future King James II. New York briefly fell under Dutch control again
And I know Louisiana's French, but this is after that.
in
I mean, before that.
1673, but was quickly returned to the English under the Treaty of Westminster in 1674, which ended the series of hostilities between the two nations. Under English rule, New York continued to grow and prosper, fueled by a thriving economy and a steady influx of immigrants arriving from Europe. The city, however, retained many of its citizens, institutions, and practices that were introduced by the Dutch.
Eventually, one of those institutional Dutch families will produce Martin van Buren, our only Dutch originated president.
Including the institution of slavery, which had become embedded in New York's economy through the shipment of slaves through the port. So much so that by the 1740s, some 20% of the residents of New York were slaves, totaling about 2,500 people. As the 18th century progressed, New York emerged as a center of political and cultural change. In the years leading up to the American Revolution, the city served as a hub for the dissident organization called the Sons of Liberty, who targeted the sizable portion of New York's population who were fervent royalists. Similarly, the Stamp Act Congress of 1765 was convened in New York to unite the American colonies in opposition to the Stamp Act introduced by the British government. This articulated the grievances and taxation rights of the 13 colonies, which ultimately laid the
Revolutionary
ideological
War.
framework for revolution and the subsequent Declaration of Independence. During the War of Independence, New York City continued to play
And we'll have to watch. I think we're about to talk about the Battle of Manhattan, I believe. I'll have to talk about that a little bit more when we. I know there's a video I definitely need to watch. Don't oversimplify it. That kind of goes into this a little bit, but specifically the New York-ish area in terms of the battles. I have to do some reaction to that.
a pivotal role. Whilst it was initially occupied by the forces of the Continental Army when war broke out in 1775, the Battle of Long Island,
Long
which was
Island.
fought in
That's what I
August
was
of the
thinking.
following year, saw the American forces under General George Washington suffer a crushing defeat at the hands of the British. The subsequent occupation of New York by British forces would last for the duration of the war, with the city serving as the strategic base for their military operations across the country. By 1783, however, the war was ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, and the British began to evacuate their forces from the city, bringing an end to nearly a decade of occupation, which resulted in New York emerging as a shining light of liberty.
I wish we had like a population counter at this point, like how many people were in New York right after the war.
In the new American nation. In January 1785, New York was chosen to be the new national capital and played host
For a little bit.
to some of the most important events in the nation's early history, with the first president, George Washington, being inaugurated at Federal Hall in April 1789, as well as the
Federal Hall. Is Federal Hall still a thing? Is it still a thing? Is it still like originally in its original spot?
first Congress being formed and the Bill of Rights being drafted, all in the same building on present-day Wall Street. With the
Oh,
dawning of the 19th century, New York had emerged as a global center of finance and banking, with Wall Street and Lower Manhattan being home to the Bank of New York, which was founded by Alexander Hamilton back in 1784, as well as the New York Stock Exchange, which was set up in 1792. Similarly, as the early 1800s progressed, New York continued to prosper as a center of trade and commerce, with the construction of the Erie Canal, linking the Great Lakes to the Hudson River and the Atlantic Ocean. Completed in 1825, the canal transformed New York into the nation's premier port, overtaking the likes of Boston and Philadelphia in both importance and capacity. As the city continued to grow in size, New York underwent a dramatic transformation as waves of immigrants from Europe and Asia swelled its population from 60,000 in 1800 to well over 500,000 by the middle of the century. Newcomers
growth.
fleeing poverty,
Is this like a representation of Times Square?
persecution, and political upheaval arrived in New York City in search of opportunity and a fresh start, thus transforming the city into a vibrant melting pot of cultures and ethnicities. The number of inhabitants within the city was also furthered by the abolition of slavery within the state of New York in 1827, leading to an influx of freed African Americans. The Lower East Side in particular became a focal point of immigrant life, with crowded tenements and bustling marketplaces teeming with new arrivals from Italy, Ireland, Eastern Europe, and China. However, with this dramatic increase in population came unintended consequences. The overcrowded living conditions were hotbeds for diseases such as cholera, which broke out multiple times beginning in the 1830s, and many of the packed tenement buildings were destroyed in the Great Fire of New York in 1835.
So many parallels with London too, like the Great Fire of New York, the Great Fire of London, cholera. Of course, there was massive plagues that hit London over the period of their existence. Crazy. Of course, cholera is more for drinking water, right? I would imagine. So it's dripping into the drinking water. Is that what happened there?
Which leveled some 50 acres of the city. Other poor and overcrowded neighborhoods, such as the Five Points and Hell's Kitchen, also had their share of poverty-related problems, with notorious criminal gangs, such as the Dead Rabbits and the Bowery Boys.
Yeah, I've
roaming
never
the
heard of these
streets,
people.
resorting
That's
to petty theft,
interesting.
robbery, and violence to make ends meet. The city's problems continued with the outbreak of the American Civil War, which engulfed the country in 1861. Although New York State was firmly part of the Union, the city's strong commercial ties to the South, coupled with its growing immigrant population and anger over conscription, led to divided sympathies.
Think about that. Like you immigrate to this country in like 1855 or something like that, right? And you start growing up into this American life, and like New York's been abolitionist for 20-30 years at this point, 1827. So like, about 28 years at this point. So you really have no thought in your head that we're going to have a civil war break out. Because you just immigrated here. You might not know the politics, might not even speak the language. But now you are caught in the middle of a civil war. It's insane. I bet you that's impacted so many immigrant families.
The New York draft riot of 1863 broke out over the resentment towards wealthy men being able to buy their way out of conscription.
Wow.
And the resulting 5-day riot marked one of the worst incidents of civil unrest in American history. Following the war, New York City entered somewhat of a cultural boom. Central Park, which opened to the public back in 1858, provided a green oasis and recreational space for all New Yorkers to enjoy. Meanwhile, the theaters of Broadway and the concert halls of Carnegie Hall played host to a dazzling array of performers and productions, cementing the city's reputation as the cultural capital of the nation. Similarly, New York saw the founding of several museums and libraries during this time, with the American Museum of Natural History being founded in 1869, the Metropolitan Museum of Art opening in 1870, and the New York Public Library being established in 1895.
Huge.
The increase in cultural offerings also saw journalism flourish, with newspapers like the New York Times, New York Herald, and New York World playing major roles in shaping public opinion, and the city itself becoming a national hub for the media industry. New York's continuing expansion further northward up the island of Manhattan, as well as development of connections into the neighboring towns over on Long Island, spurred the development of infrastructure projects, such as the Brooklyn Bridge, which was completed in 1883. Then, in 1886,
That long ago.
perhaps New York's most iconic and defining landmark was gifted to the city by the nation of France. The Statue of Liberty was sited in the middle of New York Harbor and served as a beacon of hope to the millions of immigrants arriving on its shores, before many of them were to pass through the immigration office established on Ellis Island in 1892.
Got to be the biggest landmark just by culture alone in the entire country.
And then onto new lives in America. The rapid scale of development within the city continued well into the following 20th century, with the New York City subway opening in 1904.
That was a subway car? That's got to be the engineers, right? It's got to be the engineers. Just testing it. If it's not, that's insane.
Connecting City Hall to Harlem and Brooklyn. The city's skyline also saw its share of development during this time, with the likes of the Williamsburg and the Manhattan bridges opening in 1903 and 1909 respectively. These feats were only outdone in scale by the competitive efforts of architects and developers who wished to build the tallest and most extravagant buildings in the world,
Empire.
which resulted in the iconic silhouettes of skyscrapers like the Woolworth Building, the Chrysler Building, and the Empire State Building, being topped off by the early 1930s, which proudly displayed the city's economic and architectural confidence to the world. Meanwhile, below ground, speakeasies and jazz clubs flourished
We're in the 20s,
during the city's
30s.
era of decadence in the 1920s. Even though this coincided with the years of Prohibition, when the federal government outlawed the sale of alcohol, bootleg liquor and illicit entertainment flowed hand in hand.
The Gatsby
So
era.
much so that the city was estimated to have a proliferation of anywhere between 30,000 to 100,000 illegal clubs alone.
Oh.
The party times of the Roaring Twenties, however, came to an abrupt end with the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the ensuing Great Depression of the 1930s. Banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment soared, leaving millions of New Yorkers finding themselves out of work and struggling to make ends meet. Many of the city's parks, including Central Park, became home to thousands of desperate people who constructed shantytowns named
Wow.
Hoovervilles,
Yeah.
in an ironic jab toward the President Herbert Hoover for allowing their misfortune to happen.
Poor guy.
The situation for the city only began to improve with the outbreak of World War II in 1939. Although the United States would not enter the war for another 2 years,
The
New
Allies.
York City found itself mobilizing for war as factories churned out tanks, planes, and ships for the Allied cause, while the city's ports and docks became vital lifelines for the transportation of goods across the Atlantic. When the US did finally join the conflict in 1941, many of its troops, sailors, and airmen found themselves embarking on huge ocean liners out of New York's docks that carried them on their journey to the front lines. The post-war years saw New York transform into the city that it is today. While many of the world's other great cities lay in ruins, New York emerged with new global prominence. It became the home of the United Nations headquarters in 1952 and inherited Paris's role as the center of the global art world, as well as
Wow.
becoming a rival to London's financial markets by
Yeah.
the 1960s.
It's hot.
Although during the 1970s, the city became notorious for its levels of crime and
Yeah.
deprivation, efforts to
Beer City.
modernize and rejuvenate saw many of the older pre-war buildings
Yeah.
redeveloped or torn down to make way for modern glass and steel constructions, such as the World Trade Center, which was completed in 1973. Since then, like all cities, New York has continued to experience its fair share
Surprised he didn't hit on 9/11 as much.
of trials and tribulations. What makes New York perhaps the greatest city in the world, however, is that no matter how many times it has been knocked down and set back, it has been able to pull itself back up and reinvent itself in such a way that perhaps many other cities of the world would struggle.
I think that was you paid homage to it right there with that comment. But yeah, like I was just sitting back and listening and learning. You know, it's you know, between prehistory to about 1500, 1600, you just really don't have a lot going on. You just have the Algonquin tribes just really rule the area. Then they hand it off to Homeboy, and Homeboy has this New Netherlands, New Amsterdam, and then York. Well, the Duke of York, off his behalf, they overrule this entire colony, become New York. New York then starts to become part of the colonies. The colonies break off. The colonies then, of course, start to be autonomous and work as a nation at the same time. New York starts to just grow, and this just the geography of where it sits in terms of the economic trade, pretty much a almost one of the first things that you would hit coming from Europe. So it's just placed perfectly, just for the trade situation, and then the land that it's on, and the opportunity with that land near the ports. That's how you get a booming, huge growth, especially with the immigration influx of people going to supplement that economy. Nothing but growth possibilities here, and that's exactly what happened. So, yeah, yeah, I do say there's so many eastern cities that have toppled London, and we watched I think we watched a video maybe a few weeks ago, and it was about the the top cities and population. So like if you look at cities in Japan or China, like they topple this number when it comes to population and growth. So I'd love to look at those cities too in the future. But if you made it this far, I implore you to hit that subscribe button so we can watch more videos together in the future and react to them. But until next time, peace out. Bye bye.